3,000 years ago, in the humid lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, a civilization most people have never heard of crushed the seeds of a strange tropical fruit, mixed them with water and chili peppers, and created a bitter, foamy drink they believed connected them to the gods. That civilization was the Olmec, and the drink they invented would eventually become the most craved food product on the planet, generating over $130 billion every single year. But the journey from sacred jungle ritual to the candy aisle at your local grocery store is one of the strangest, bloodiest, and most unlikely stories in human history. To understand where chocolate came from, you have to go back to roughly 1,500 years before the Common Era. The Olmec civilization, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, thrived in the tropical lowlands along the Gulf of Mexico. These were the people who carved those massive stone heads you may have seen in history textbooks. And deep in their territory, cacao trees grew wild in the shaded understory of the rainforest. The Olmec figured out something that would change the course of human civilization. They discovered that if you fermented the pulp surrounding cacao seeds, then dried and roasted those seeds, you could grind them into a paste that produced a drink unlike anything else in nature. The earliest archaeological evidence of cacao use comes from pottery vessels found in Honduras and Belize, residue traces dating back over 3,000 years. And to the Olmec, this was not some casual beverage. This was something sacred. When the Olmec civilization eventually declined, their knowledge of cacao did not disappear. It passed directly to the Maya, who took chocolate and turned it into something even more central to their culture. The Maya word cacao is actually where our modern word cacao comes from. And for the Maya, this drink was woven into virtually every important moment of life. Birth ceremonies, marriage rituals, funerals, religious offerings to the gods. Cacao appears in Maya art, in their hieroglyphs, and in their creation mythology. The Popol Vuh, the sacred Maya text, describes cacao as one of the foods the gods used to create human beings. Think about that for a second. They did not just enjoy chocolate. They believed humanity was literally made from it. But the Maya did not drink chocolate the way you and I think of it. There was no sugar. There was no milk. Maya chocolate was a thick, bitter, sometimes gritty drink made from ground cacao paste mixed with water, cornmeal, chili peppers, and vanilla. They would pour it back and forth between vessels to create a prized layer of foam on top. That foam was considered the most valuable part of the drink. Some historians believe the Maya reserved their finest cacao drinks for royalty and priests, while commoners might have had access to simpler versions. Cacao beans themselves became so valuable that they were used as currency throughout Mesoamerica. You could buy a turkey for 100 cacao beans, a slave for around 1,000. Money literally grew on trees. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to dominance in central Mexico during the 1400s, cacao had become the most prized commodity in the region. But here is the twist. Cacao trees cannot grow in the dry, high-altitude climate around the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs had built one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, but they could not grow their own chocolate. So they did what empires do. They conquered the regions where cacao grew and demanded it as tribute. Massive quantities of cacao beans flowed into Tenochtitlan from conquered provinces. Some estimates suggest the Aztec Empire collected nearly 200 loads of cacao beans per year in tribute alone, each load weighing roughly 50 pounds. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma II reportedly drank as many as 50 cups of chocolate a day, served in golden goblets. The Aztec version of the drink was called exocolotl, which roughly translates to bitter water. And just like the Maya before them, the Aztecs believed cacao was divine in origin. Their mythology held that the god Quetzalcoatl had brought cacao to earth and was punished by the other gods for sharing something so precious with mortals. Xocolotl was associated with wisdom, power, and vitality. Warriors drank it before battle. Priests used it in ceremonies. It was offered to sacrificial victims before their deaths as a final act of reverence. Chocolate was not candy. It was blood and spirit and empire, all in one cup. Then, in 1519, a Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico with around 500 soldiers, and everything changed. When Cortés and his men first encountered the Aztec court, they were reportedly offered cups of xocolotl. The Spanish hated it. The bitter, spicy drink was nothing like what Europeans were used to. One early Spanish account described it as a drink fit more for pigs than for people. But Cortés was not interested in the taste. He was interested in the economics. He quickly realized that cacao beans were the currency of an entire empire. And if you controlled the cacao, you controlled the wealth. After the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521, the Spanish began shipping cacao beans back to Spain. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Someone, likely Spanish nuns in colonial convents in Guatemala or Mexico, started experimenting with the recipe. They added sugar, they added cinnamon and vanilla. They heated it up instead of serving it cold. And suddenly, this bitter Aztec warrior drink became something entirely different. It became sweet, warm, and dangerously addictive. Spain kept their modified chocolate recipe a closely guarded secret for nearly a century. While the rest of Europe had no idea what they were missing, the Spanish aristocracy was quietly obsessing over this new luxury drink behind closed doors. The secret eventually got out. By the early 1600s, chocolate had spread to Italy, France, and England, and European elites lost their minds over it. In France, King Louis XIV's wife Maria Theresa of Spain was reportedly so obsessed with chocolate that she drank it multiple times a day and was rumored to have blackened teeth from the sugar. The French court followed her lead, and soon hot chocolate was the fashionable drink of Versailles. In 1657, the first chocolate house opened in London. These were essentially the Starbucks of the 17th century, but far more exclusive. Chocolate houses became gathering places for the wealthy, the powerful, and the politically connected. You would go to discuss business, gossip about rivals, and drink cup after cup of hot chocolate sweetened with sugar. Samuel Pepys, the famous English diarist, wrote about visiting chocolate houses in London during the 1660s. Political factions would each claim their own favorite chocolate house as unofficial headquarters. Some of England's most famous institutions started as chocolate houses. White's, founded in 1693 as a hot chocolate shop, eventually became one of the most exclusive gentlemen's clubs in the world and is still operating today. Meanwhile, doctors across Europe were prescribing chocolate as medicine. They recommended it for everything from stomach ailments to fatigue to melancholy. Whether it actually cured any of those things is debatable, but it certainly made patients happier about being sick. But chocolate had a problem. For over 2 centuries after it arrived in Europe, chocolate existed only as a drink, and it was expensive. Producing drinkable chocolate from raw cacao beans was labor-intensive. The beans had to be roasted, shelled, and ground by hand, resulting in a thick paste that was difficult to dissolve in water and left a greasy, gritty texture. Chocolate was a luxury for the rich, and it was going to stay that way unless someone figured out how to make it cheaper and easier to produce. That someone arrived in 1828. A Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten invented a hydraulic press that could squeeze most of the natural fat, known as cocoa butter, out of roasted cacao beans. What remained was a dry cake that could be pulverized into a fine powder. Van Houten also treated this powder with alkaline salts to reduce its bitterness, a process still called Dutching to this day. This was a massive breakthrough. Suddenly, the same ingredient that had been a luxury for centuries could be produced faster, cheaper, and in far greater quantities. Cocoa powder dissolved easily in water or milk, making chocolate drinks smoother, cheaper, and accessible to ordinary people for the first time in history. But Van Houten's invention did something even more important that he probably never anticipated. By separating cocoa butter from cocoa solids, he created the 2 key ingredients that would make solid chocolate possible. And this is the part that changed everything. In 1847, a British company called J.S. Fry and Sons figured out that if you took cocoa powder, added sugar, and then mixed it back with melted cocoa butter, the result was a smooth, moldable paste that hardened into a solid bar. They called it eating chocolate, and it was the first modern chocolate bar the world had ever seen. For 3,000 years, chocolate had been a drink. In one afternoon in a Bristol factory, it became something you could hold in your hand, break into pieces, and eat wherever you wanted. The entire relationship between humans and chocolate shifted in that single moment. The next 30 years saw an explosion of innovation that reads like a highlight reel of everything you have ever seen on a candy shelf. In 1875, a Swiss candle maker named Daniel Peter had been trying for 8 years to figure out how to mix milk with chocolate. The problem was that milk contains water, and water causes chocolate to seize up and become grainy. Peter could not crack it. Then his neighbor, a man named Henri Nestlé, showed him a product he had recently invented, a powdered condensed milk. Peter combined Nestlé's condensed milk with chocolate, and milk chocolate was born. Yes, that Nestlé, the same company. That neighborly collaboration turned into one of the largest food corporations on Earth. 4 years later, in 1879, another Swiss chocolatier named Rodolphe Lindt accidentally left his mixing machine running overnight. When he came back in the morning, he discovered that the extended mixing had produced chocolate with an incredibly smooth, velvety texture, unlike anything anyone had tasted before. He called the process conking, after the shell-shaped basin of his machine. Conking is still the standard process used in chocolate manufacturing today. Within the span of about 50 years, chocolate went from a gritty, expensive drink for European aristocrats to a smooth, sweet, solid food product that could be produced on an industrial scale. The modern chocolate bar had arrived, and the world was about to get very, very hungry. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about how chocolate became a global obsession. In the early 1900s, a caramel maker from rural Pennsylvania named Milton Snavely Hershey visited the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and saw German chocolate-making machinery in action. He was so captivated that he sold his successful caramel company for $1 million, which was an enormous sum at the time, and bet everything on chocolate. Hershey's genius was not in making the best chocolate. He knew that Swiss and Belgian chocolatiers had him beat on quality. His genius was in making chocolate cheap enough that every single person in America could afford to buy it. Hershey built an entire town around his chocolate factory in central Pennsylvania. He called it Hershey, Pennsylvania. It had streets named Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue. It had its own schools, parks, a trolley system, and an amusement park. The Hershey bar, introduced in 1900, became the first mass-produced, mass-marketed chocolate bar in the United States. By the 1920s, Hershey was producing millions of bars per day, and his competitors were right behind him. Frank Mars introduced the Milky Way bar in 1923. His son Forrest Mars created M&Ms in 1941, inspired by a method he had seen in Spain where soldiers ate chocolate pellets coated in a hard sugar shell to prevent melting. The candy bar wars of the 20th century were on. And then came a development that nobody could have predicted. Chocolate went to war. During World War II, the United States military commissioned Hershey to produce a special chocolate bar for soldiers. The requirements were specific. It had to weigh 4 ounces, be high in energy, withstand high temperatures, and, this is the strange part, it had to taste just barely better than a boiled potato. The military did not want soldiers eating their emergency rations as snacks. They wanted them saved for survival situations. Hershey produced what soldiers called the D-ration bar, and over the course of the war, the company produced over 3 billion of them. 3 billion. Chocolate bars were included in every soldier's field ration. And when American troops liberated towns across Europe and the Pacific, they handed out chocolate to local children and civilians. An entire generation around the world got their first taste of chocolate from an American GI. After the war, chocolate consumption exploded globally. The returning soldiers were hooked, and the international demand created by wartime distribution opened up new markets everywhere. Mars, Cadbury, Nestle, and Hershey raced to dominate the post-war candy market. In Britain, Cadbury had already been a household name for decades. The Cadbury family were Quakers who originally got into the chocolate business partly as a moral crusade. They saw chocolate as a wholesome alternative to alcohol and gin, which were ravaging the English working class. John Cadbury opened his first shop in Birmingham in 1824, and his sons later built the model village of Bournville for their factory workers, complete with parks, sports facilities, and decent housing. It was the British version of what Hershey would later do in Pennsylvania. The 20th century saw chocolate become deeply embedded in Western culture in ways that would have been unthinkable to the Maya priests who first brewed it. Valentine's Day became inseparable from heart-shaped boxes of chocolate. Easter became synonymous with chocolate eggs and bunnies. Halloween became the single largest candy-selling event in the United States, with chocolate accounting for the majority of the roughly $4 billion Americans spend on Halloween candy each year. But this is where most people get the story wrong. They think chocolate is just about candy bars and holiday gifts. The modern chocolate industry is something far bigger and far more complicated than a box of assorted truffles. Today, the global chocolate market is worth over $130 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that is larger than the GDP of over 100 countries. And the supply chain behind that market stretches from tropical farms in West Africa to gleaming factories in Switzerland and massive distribution networks that touch every continent on Earth. Roughly 70% of the world's cacao is grown in West Africa, with Ivory Coast and Ghana alone producing more than half the global supply. The cacao farming industry employs millions of people, and the vast majority of them are smallholder farmers working plots of land smaller than 5 acres. And here is the uncomfortable reality that the chocolate industry has spent decades trying to avoid talking about. Many of those cacao farms rely on child labor. Reports from organizations working in West Africa have documented well over 1 million children working in hazardous conditions on cacao farms in Ivory Coast and Ghana alone. These are children as young as 5 years old using machetes, carrying heavy loads, and being exposed to dangerous pesticides. In 2001, major chocolate companies signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, pledging to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains. Over 2 decades later, the problem persists. The irony is brutal. A product that brings so much pleasure to hundreds of millions of consumers depends on a supply chain where the people who grow the raw ingredient often cannot afford to buy the finished product. That tension between pleasure and exploitation is driving one of the most interesting movements in the modern food industry. Over the past 15 years, the bean-to-bar movement has transformed the way serious chocolate lovers think about what they eat. Small craft chocolate makers are sourcing cacao beans directly from farmers, paying significantly higher prices than the commodity market rate, and producing chocolate with a level of care and attention to flavor that mirrors what happened with specialty coffee and craft beer. These makers treat cacao the way winemakers treat grapes, as a product whose flavor is profoundly shaped by its variety, its terroir, its fermentation, and its processing. A single origin bar made from cacao grown in Madagascar tastes completely different from one made with beans from Ecuador or Vietnam. The differences are as dramatic as the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet Sauvignon. This movement is revealing something that the big chocolate companies have obscured for over a century. Chocolate is not one flavor. It is hundreds of flavors. Depending on the genetics of the cacao tree, the soil it grows in, how the beans are fermented and dried, and how the chocolate is roasted and conched, you can get tasting notes that range from bright citrus and red berries to deep tobacco and leather. The mass-produced chocolate bars that dominate the market use heavily roasted, heavily processed cacao, blended from dozens of sources specifically to create a consistent, uniform flavor, which is fine if all you want is sweetness and familiarity. But the craft chocolate world is showing people that chocolate can be as complex and nuanced as fine wine or single malt whiskey. But the future of chocolate is not guaranteed. Climate change poses a serious threat to cacao production worldwide. Cacao trees are extraordinarily sensitive to their environment. They need consistent temperatures between 65 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, high humidity, abundant rainfall, and protection from direct sunlight. They can only grow within a narrow band roughly 20 degrees north and south of the equator. Climate models suggest that rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns could make many current cacao-growing regions unsuitable for production by 2050. In parts of Ghana and Ivory Coast, temperatures have already risen enough to stress cacao trees, reducing yields and making them more vulnerable to disease. A fungal infection called black pod disease and an insect pest called the cacao swollen shoot virus are already devastating plantations across West Africa, and warmer conditions are making both problems worse. Some researchers are working on developing more resilient cacao varieties through selective breeding and even genetic editing. Others are experimenting with growing cacao in new regions, testing whether places like southern India, parts of Southeast Asia, and even controlled greenhouse environments could supplement traditional growing areas. And some companies are investing in lab-grown chocolate alternatives that replicate the flavor of cacao without requiring the actual bean. Scientists have figured out how to ferment other plant materials to produce compounds that mimic chocolate's flavor profile, though whether consumers will accept the substitute remains an open question. Think about the full arc of this story for a moment. A jungle fruit that an ancient civilization believed was divine became the currency of an empire, the secret pleasure of European kings, the fuel of industrial revolution, the comfort ration of soldiers at war, and eventually the most universally craved flavor on the planet. Chocolate has been money, medicine, ritual, weapon, and gift. It has built fortunes, destroyed ecosystems, and connected cultures across thousands of miles and thousands of years. The Olmec grinding cacao in the tropical lowlands of Mexico 3,000 years ago could never have imagined a world where their sacred drink would be freeze-dried into powder, molded into bunny shapes, stuffed inside croissants, drizzled over ice cream, and sold in bags at airport convenience stores. And yet, for all the changes, something fundamental has not changed at all. The reason chocolate captivates us in the 21st century is the same reason it captivated the Maya. There is something about the combination of compounds in cacao, the theobromine, the phenylethylamine, the anandamide, the over 600 distinct flavor compounds, that triggers a response in the human brain that no other food quite matches. Scientists have studied why chocolate cravings are so uniquely intense compared to other foods, and the answer appears to be that chocolate hits multiple pleasure pathways simultaneously. It is not just the sugar. It is not just the fat. It is the specific chemical cocktail inside the cacao bean itself, a cocktail that evolution spent millions of years perfecting, and that humans stumbled onto in the jungles of Central America 30 centuries ago. From sacred ritual to global obsession, the story of chocolate is really the story of what happens when humans discover something that feels too good to forget. Empires rose and fell chasing it. Inventors spent their lives perfecting it. And today, the average person in the United States eats roughly 11 pounds of chocolate per year, without thinking twice about the 3,000-year journey that put it in their hands. That is the history of chocolate. And chances are, the next time you break off a piece of a chocolate bar, you will think about it just a little bit differently. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite chocolate, because honestly, I am curious, and I will see you in the next one.